Chapter 4 of The Power of Israel in the United States by James Petras. Exposing the Expose, Seymour Hersh and the Missing Zionist-Israeli Connection. As I read through Hersh's highly publicized and influential reports in The New Yorker on torture in US-occupied Iraq, it became increasingly apparent that this was not a thoroughly researched expose of the higher-ups responsible for the policy of torture. Hersh's reportage was a selective account guided by selected questions about selected officials. As one reads through Hersh's version of events with increasing incredulity, one comes to realize that Hersh hangs his whole argument and expose of U.S. officials involved in the use of torture on one person, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, but not on the other top defense officials who were extremely influential and responsible for war policy, establishing intelligence agencies, and coordinating strategy and tactics during the occupation. Rumsfeld was part of an elite which sanctioned and promoted torture. Through his expose, Hersh deliberately omits the role of the Zionists, Wolfowitz, Feith, numbers 2 and 3 in the Pentagon, who supported and promoted the war and torture interrogation, and particularly the Israeli experts who led seminars teaching the U.S. military intelligence their torture interrogation techniques of Arab prisoners based on their half-century of practice. In looking for documentary sources of torture interrogation, Hersh relies on academic texts and 20-year-old CIA manuals, not Israeli practice widely disseminated by the Mossad and Shin Bet advisors presently involved in torture in neighboring Palestine and Iraq today. Hersh is presented in the mass media as an iconoclastic investigative journalist, a role which gives his reportages and exposés a great deal of credibility. Yet it was Seymour Hersh who publicly defended torture of suspects and their family members as a method of interrogation, citing the Israeli examples in the wake of September 11, justifying torture in the same way as the Pentagon now justifies the torture of Iraqi suspects. Instead of citing an obscure professor at the University of Chicago, Hersh should have cited the influential tract defending torture by Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz, a fellow Zionist, widely read by the civilian militarists who run the Pentagon today and direct the chain of command leading to interrogation through torture. Hersh's account fails to provide a political context in the Pentagon and in the Middle East for the systematic use of torture. To understand the issue of the U.S. practice of torture and violent abuse of Iraqi prisoners and civilians requires an examination of the ideological demonization of the Iraqi population, the Arabs, and the U.S. unconditional political and military support for the State of Israel, the principal long-term, large-scale practitioner of torture against Arabs. The most vitriolic, systematic denigration of Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East is found in the writings and speeches of influential U.S.-based Zionist ideologues like the Pipes, father and son, the Crystals, senior and junior, the Kagans, Cohens, Goldhagens, and others. The first step toward justifying torture is to dehumanize the victim, to label them as Untermensch, congenitally violent savages. The Zionists in the U.S. were merely following the pronouncements of their ideological mentors in Israel, who not infrequently proclaimed that the only thing the Arab understands is force. Sharon, Golda Meir, Dayan, Rabin, etc. The Zionist ideologues in the Pentagon were influential in arousing hatred of Arabs in several ways. In their defense of Israel, they deliberately distorted the nature of Israel's colonial war, blaming the Palestinian victims for the systematic violence that Israel inflicted on them. The ideologues defended every Israeli violent action, the massacre of Jenin, the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, the murderous assault on Rafah, the killing of UN aid workers and peace activists, the monstrous wall ghettoizing a whole people, the mass murder of hundreds of Palestinians, and the destruction of thousands of homes in Gaza. Israeli violence against Palestinians made a deep impression on U.S. Zionists who generalized and deepened their animus to Arab and Muslims throughout the Middle East, but particularly in Iraq, where they were in a position to implement their policies. The Zionists and torture in Iraq. The Pentagon's main source of quote-unquote intelligence and propaganda for the invasion and occupation of Iraq was in part provided by the Office of Special Plans. The special group bypassed normal CIA and military intelligence agencies and secured its own intelligence prior to the war, and was involved in securing intelligence during the first stages of the occupation before it was dismantled. As the Iraqi resistance increased its effectiveness and the U.S. justification for war, weapons of mass destruction, was proved to be a total fabrication of the special group, the top echelon of the Pentagon, Rumsfeld and the Zionists, grew desperate. They collectively passed the orders to intensify and extend torture to all Iraqi suspects in all the prisons. It is a gross simplification, even disinformation, to say that the line of command was limited to Rumsfeld when Wolfowitz, Feith, and Abrams were so intimately involved in everyday policies, prosecuting the war, defending the occupation, and controlling intelligence. Even more than Rumsfeld, the Zionist zealots in the Pentagon were the most ardent promoters of introducing Israeli methods of torture and humiliating Arab suspects, and lauding Israeli successes in dealing with the Arabs. They, not military intelligence, promoted the use of Israelis' experts in interrogation. They encouraged Israeli-led seminars in urban warfare and interrogation techniques for the U.S. military intelligence officers and private contractors. Nothing about the responsibility of the Pentagon Zionists in the torture of Iraqis appears in HERSH's expose. The glaring omissions are deliberate, as they are obvious. They form a systematic pattern and serve the purpose of exonerating the Pentagon, Zionists, and Israel, and hanging the entire responsibility for war crimes on Rumsfeld. A close look at HERSH's method. A close reading of HERSH's series of articles in The New Yorker reveals his premises and political perspectives, none of which have anything to do with democratic values or concern with human rights. HERSH's principal concern is that Rumsfeld's blanket order to use torture disrupted the operations of an elite group made up of professional commandos involved in a secret special access program designed to murder, kidnap, torture, terror suspects throughout the world. In other words, by involving thousands of everyday U.S. soldiers, referred to by one of HERSH's sources as hillbillies, as torturers in Iraq, Rumsfeld was endangering the operation of professional killers throughout the world. HERSH's second major concern was that the discovery of the torture would hurt America's prospects in the war on terror. In other words, a tactic he attributed solely and wrongfully to Rumsfeld was endangering the U.S. empire-building capacity. HERSH's empire-centric view refuses to recognize the elementary rights of self-determination and international law's non-derogable prohibition against torture and extrajudicial executions. HERSH's third apparent concern is with Rumsfeld's bypassing the CIA and other intelligence agencies and his attempt to monopolize intelligence. This is a bit disingenuous. Wolfowitz and Feith set up the Special Intelligence Agency that fed Rumsfeld the fabricated intelligence. They promoted Chalabi, known throughout Washington intelligence circles as totally unreliable, as an impeccable source of inside information on Saddam's non-existent weapons of mass destruction, knowing in advance that they were passing phony data. As Wolfowitz later cynically admitted, the decision was made to launch the U.S. invasion over banned weapons because it was the only issue they could agree upon. HERSH is not stupid. He knew what everyone else in Washington and out of government knows. The Zionists in the Pentagon were pushing for war with Iraq before 9/11, even before they took office in Washington and were working with the Israel state, and were intent on having the U.S. destroy Iraq at any price, including the loss of American lives, budget-busting deficits, imperiling oil interests, and jeopardizing U.S. global imperial interests. They launched the invasion by passing the military central command by deliberately falsifying the anticipated response of the conquered Iraqi people. Quote unquote, they will welcome us as liberators, Wolf and Pearl, and were intent on destroying Iraqi civil and state structures under the guise of de-Baathification purges in order to forever undermine Iraq's capacity to challenge Israel's domination of the Middle East. None of HERSH's questions explore these well-known facts about who is responsible for the atrocities against Iraqis. He didn't have to cite unnamed intelligence or Pentagon sources, General Anthony Zinni, and many non-Zionist insiders, as well as the CIA and Central Command, knew about the Zionist promoters' plans and, moreover, knew the role Feith played in pushing for harsher interrogation techniques. But HERSH ignored these questions. These Zionists and their ideological supporters and advisors who have, post-invasion, done everything possible to undermine any Iraqi economic recovery and capacity to run their own education, health, and electoral systems. De-Baathification was meant to turn Iraq into a backward, tribal, divided desert country run by their protege, Chalabi, the only candidate who would recognize Israel, supply it with oil and water, and support Mideast integration under Israeli hegemony. The Zionist Pentagonistas succeeded in securing the war, they succeeded in destroying basic Iraqi social services, and they destroyed the Iraqi state, courts, military, civil services. However, in their blind subservience to Israel, they overlooked the fact that the disbanded professional soldiers and purged civil leaders and professionals would become part of an experienced armed resistance, that Iraq would become ungovernable, that U.S. rule would crumble, that the U.S. would become bogged down in a politically lost war, and that its puppet regime would have neither legitimacy nor popular support. The Zionists did what they thought was best for Israel, even if it provoked greater opposition worldwide, including in the U.S., where majority had turned against the occupation by May 2004. Only the Israeli transmission belt, AIPAC, would cheer Bush and his continuation of the occupation and pledge allegiance to the Israeli war against Palestinians. When their self-serving prediction of an Iraqi welcoming committee turned into a valiant popular anti-colonial war, Feith and his underlings called for greater use of more forceful interrogation methods. Rumsfeld and Feith encouraged Israeli-type torture to humiliate the Arabs. Meanwhile, Kagan's call to bomb the Arab Street was tried and failed to intimidate the Iraqi resistance. HERSH's expose of Rumsfeld as the only top culprit turned up at a convenient moment when U.S. policy had failed and most knowledgeable officials were moving closer to identifying the role of the Pentagon Zionists. It was clever by half. Rumsfeld was universally despised in Congress, among the professional military, and a host of others for his policies and arrogant public face. Even in exposing Rumsfeld, however, HERSH was careful to do so in a fashion that allowed his Zionist colleagues to continue in office unscathed. Furthermore, HERSH justified some of Rumsfeld's act of illegal terror by describing legalistic obstacles to eliminating terrorists. HERSH's support for Rumsfeld's resort to unaccountable commandos engaging in assassination, kidnapping, and torture of suspects around the world serves in effect to condone those tactics after Rumsfeld leaves office. Requiring a perp, HERSH dragged in a fifth-level functionary working under Feith, Stefan Cambon, whom he tells us was deeply involved in the torture of prisoners. More involved than his Zionist superiors? We might ask the peerless investigatory journalists how it is that HERSH blames those above, Rumsfeld, and those below, Cambon, but never focuses on Feith and Wolfowitz, who designed and directed the policy. In setting up Cambon for the expose, HERSH profiles Cambon in terms that fit the Zionists with greater pertinence. He advocated war with Iraq, following Wolfowitz, Feith, Pearl, and Abrams. He disdained the CIA, whom the Pentagon Zionists viewed as too cautious, attacking it for not finding WMD. Since Cambon functioned under Wolfowitz and Feith, he was simply repeating what his bosses wanted to hear, and perhaps that's why they entrusted him with the relevant, dirty task of extracting intelligence via torture. HERSH tries to link Cambon with the extension of the torture practiced selectively by the Special Agency Program, SAP. But SAP was already operative before Cambon took office, and its operations were under the direction of Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Feith, and Abrams. HERSH's dating of the torture as commencing in August 2003 with Cambon and Major General Miller's assignment from Guantanamo is false. It started earlier under the SAP and with Israeli-trained interrogators. Moreover, it was the Pentagon, headed by the same three, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and Feith, that ordered Miller's use of torture on suspects at Guantanamo in the first place, then moved him to Iraq as a reward for exemplary work. HERSH does not explore Miller's links with Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and Feith before going to Iraq. He simply aborts the analysis, looks at the middle and lower levels of power, Cambon, Miller, interrogators, and enlisted soldiers. Out of this framework, HERSH comes up with a detailed piece of selective investigatory journalism. He exposes some, but covers up for those most actively involved in invoking the war and directing it in a way that served Israeli interests. The cost in U.S. lives and the degradation of young U.S. servicemen forced to assume the role of torturers is of little concern to the Pentagon Zionists. The Pentagon's Zionists are under attack. Marine General Anthony Zinni, Senator Fritz Hollings, and other prominent political, diplomatic, and military leaders have openly identified the role of the Pentagon Zionists in launching and directing the war to favor Israel. What seemed a visible move toward the marginalization of the pro-Israel Chalabi, the protege of Wolfowitz, Feith, and Abrams, by raiding his house and carting off his records ostensibly to investigate financial irregularities, seemed a symbolic setback. So was the U.S. abstention in the Security Council on Israel's rape of Rafah, much to the chagrin of the Israel First crowd at the AIPAC convention. In response, all the major Jewish organizations and publications from Forward to the Anti-Defamation League, AJC, and others denounced the critics of the Pentagon Zionists. Despite all the exposés of torture, killings, and rapes, major Zionist ideologues like Kristol, Krauthammer, Rubin, Pearl, Kagan, and Frum launched attacks on Bush for backing off from the war. HERSH's attempts to head off the anti-Zionist headhunting coalition by focusing on the two Goyim, Rumsfeld and Cambon, have been to no avail. The knives were drawn. Because of Zionist power in and out of government, the anti-Zionist coalition and their supporters used code words, the most common of which is neoconservative, which everyone now knows means Wolfowitz, Feith, Abrams, and other Zionists in and out of the government. AIPAC, the Anti-Defamation League, and other Israel Firsters, sensing the danger to their co-thinkers, turned to labeling critics of the neoconservative militarists anti-Semites and arousing Congress, the media, and their propaganda machine into cowing the coalition into submission. But the photos of torture, which have discredited the war policy, threaten to isolate the Zionist zealots. Faced with the indignation of the whole civilized world at the war crimes, the quote-unquote progressive Zionist apologists like HERSH take to isolating blame on Cambon and Rumsfeld and minimizing the responsibility to a few soldiers in a cell block, as did Senator Lieberman, though the U.S. military say there have now been over 100 persons indicted, itself an indicator of the scope of the problem and its origins in policy, while the AIPAC elite cheer Bush, ignoring the muck and blood of torture. Rumsfeld shrewdly tied his future to his Zionist partners in the Pentagon and outside, counting on riding on their coattails and reaping the support of the powerful Jewish lobby and their leaders in the Israeli state who stand behind them. He has few other influential allies. Conclusion. In the final analysis, the removal from office of key members of the then current crop of Zionist Pentagonistas, Wolfowitz, Feith, Abrams, Rubin, Libby, was only a temporary setback. The Zionist political organizations remain intact. Their influence over Congress remains overwhelming, and they have pledges from both major parties that Israel's cause is America's cause, Bush and Kerry. The Zionist juggernaut grinds on, securing sanctions against Syria, calling for the bombing of Iran's supposed nuclear facilities, and trying to instill an atmosphere of crisis. During his visit to Washington in May 2006, Prime Minister Olmert got Bush's backing for Israel's unilateral setting of final boundaries, thus forcing Washington to repudiate its own roadmap and its closest EU allies. In the meantime, for those who still deny Zionist power in U.S. foreign policy, one only has to read the accounts of the AIPAC conference in Washington in May 2004. At a time when Israel was killing children in the streets of Rafah and destroying hundreds of homes under the horrified eyes of the entire civilized world, when an indignant UN Security Council finally rose to its feet and unanimously condemned Israel, U.S. congressional leaders and the two major presidential candidates pledged unconditional support to Israel, evoking the bloodthirsty cheers of investment brokers, dentists, doctors, lawyers, the cream of American Jewish society. The cause of Israel is the cause of America, rang out from the mouth of every candidate as the Israelis bulldozed homes and snipers shot small girls on their way to buy candy. It was almost as if Sharon had wanted to demonstrate the power of the Zionists in the U.S., timing the vile destruction of Rafah to coincide with the AIPAC convention and the disgusting appearance of the spineless American politicians supporting ongoing crimes against humanity. Not one voice was raised in even meek protest. To those who claim that the Zionists are just one of a number of influential lobbies, try explaining the unconditional support for Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people by the most powerful politicians in the U.S. It was almost a perverse pleasure to watch Sharon smear the muck and gore of Rafah on the groveling faces of U.S. politicians. They deserve each other. But for those of us who support a democratic, anti-imperialist foreign policy, this was one of the most humiliating moments in U.S. history, something we won't read in the exposés by HERSH or the erudite Zionist treaties in defense of endless wars.